If you're interested in getting into horror books, but you have no idea where to start, then you found the right place. We're going to get into that right now. Alright, so that is one of my new favorite shirts by one of my favorite doom metal bands, Conan, yeah. Thanks for watching. My name is Jason White, and this is my channel, Jason's Weird Reads. And in case you don't know, this is my space on YouTube where I like to talk about books, mostly horror books, fantasy, and science fiction. This is my list for where I think you should, I think is a good place to start reading horror books if you're really interested, because I've been reading it since I was a teen, and I think this list is going to reflect that. It's going to sort of show my age a little, but I think I have some recent books here too. I guess we will see. But if you're curious about horror books, I think this is a pretty good list to start, because this is the type of list that got a lot of people into reading horror in the first place. So I split this up into some authors and also some topics, and I don't know how many books I have here. I have it all on my laptop here. So we're gonna get into it. First, I'm gonna start off with the King, and that's Stephen King. Stephen King, he really does have it all. Even if you don't want to read horror, there's fans of his who don't read horror. And it's because Stephen King doesn't just stick to writing horror. He's written a couple of science fiction stories. He's written a lot of fantasy or dark fantasy. His Dark Tower series is basically fantasy with some, obviously, some horror elements. But yeah, his horror books really changed the game way back in the 70s when he started, and his books started to take off. It's kind of an anomaly. It's an anomaly that happened, but you know, of course, us horror fans are happy for that. But I would suggest starting with Stephen King's earlier works, because they have more of a bite. They don't tend to go into the cheesy direction that his later works, or cheesy is not the right word. Sentimental, I think, might be the best word. And also, Stephen King was better at ending his books way back in the day, back in the 80s. I have some books here that I think are probably the best. I already did a Stephen King, where you should start reading Stephen King, and I'll put that up there, and also put that down there. But these are a couple more, and these are more horror-centric, I think. So Pet Semetary. Pet Semetary is one of my favorite Stephen King books. This book is very much about loss and grief, and it's very disturbing. I'm sure you're probably aware, even if you're not a horror fan, what Pet Semetary is. You probably at least have seen advertisements on TV for either the old one or the new one. A lot of people hate the new one, and I'm kind of on board with that. I don't know why they made it, honestly. It's not that great. Anyway, that's besides the point. The book is it's phenomenal. It's a phenomenal study on family and grief, and what grief does to you as a person. I would recommend this book to any horror fan who hasn't read it. I did say in the comments, though, in that Stephen King video, that I was hesitant to add Pet Semetary to that list because of how grim the story is. So I'm mentioning it here first, which is making me a bit of a hypocrite, I guess. But I think it's a tough go. This one is like maybe. It's pretty hardcore horror, without necessarily going into, when I say hardcore, I don't necessarily mean like gore and nastiness. This book is just very much the epitome of horror, because it takes real life situations and real life loss. I mean, a lot of horror is about loss, and it turns it into something very disturbing and grotesque, and by the end you're going to be destroyed. So this might not be the best place, but it could be a really good place for you to start, because maybe that's what you're after. I also put The Shining on here. I didn't put that on my Stephen King list either. I kind of regret that. I don't know why I didn't, but The Shining is such a good book. It's so much better, I think, than the Kubrick movie, although I do like that movie. I just don't like the characters. The funny thing is that movie was on recently on television. I was watching it, and it really cemented my idea of why, because it changes the characters as to who they were in the book. And, you know, of course, if you're going to adapt it, that's going to happen. But I don't know, I didn't like the choices. They're almost cartoonish. All of them, except for maybe Danny, the little boy. But you probably know what The Shining is about. It's about a family who decide to take care of a ski lodge, I believe, hotel. It's a big hotel anyway, in the middle of nowhere. And it often gets snowed in during the winter, and so they have people come in and take care of it during the winter months while they're closed. And hotel has a history, and so does Jack, the main character of this story. And it goes some dark places. Is the hotel haunted, or is Jack simply going insane? It's a phenomenal read, and it's a classic, or at least a modern classic for a reason. And finally, for Stephen King, I have Misery. This was on my list, of my Stephen King list, and a lot of people responded to it, and it's because it's a good book. Now, this one doesn't really have any supernatural horror in it. It's more about a very toxic, very controlling fan. I am your world's biggest fan. And yet she's going to torture you in order to make you write the next book in her favorite series. Because, lo and behold, fate was kind to Annie Wilkes. And the author got into a car crash right near her property. And damn, isn't that fine luck for her. Not so much for the author. Alright, so I moved on. My next author is Dean Koontz. Now, I'm going to put a disclaimer here because I haven't read Dean Koontz in a while. And I think Dean Koontz is really good for younger horror readers because I tried reading him recently and I couldn't do it. One reason why I couldn't do it is because I really couldn't stand. I tried it on ebook and I really couldn't stand that this book was written in the 80s and they updated it to add cell phones, and I'm just like, why? Why? It's not necessary. There was a time before cell phones where we didn't need cell phones. And in fact, the story was phantoms, and the story itself doesn't need cell phones. So you're adding in cell phones only to make them that you can't use them because of what's going on in that town. It's like, just don't. Just don't. All right, rant over. So I'm gonna recommend a couple of good ones here that are fun and that I remember being completely floored by for one reason or another. Now, I think one of the first Dean Koontz books that I read was Dragon Tears. This one is about I believe it's about a cop. It's been a while since I've read it. And it takes place all in one night, where something supernatural is happening and the main character has to solve the issue and pretty much save the world. It was a lot of fun. That's all. The biggest thing I remember is the very beginning where there's a crazy person having an issue with a vending machine, and I think the main character has to shoot that person dead. It's just a very odd scene, but the rest of the book kind of has that feel to it. It just keeps going and going and going, and you kind of feel bad for this guy. The next book I'm going to recommend is Winter Moon. This book creeped me out when I was a kid. It's about a person who's staying in a cabin, and weird things start happening in the middle of the night. And there's, I believe there's like an alternate dimension that's kind of haunting this story, if I remember correctly. But I just remember being completely, like, these two books. I started reading Dean Koontz before I started reading Stephen King. And so these books are really what cemented and brought me into the genre. And despite what I think of Dean Koontz as a writer now, I cannot take, nothing can take what he did for me as a fan of the genre. And these two books here, Dragon Tears and Winter Moon, are huge examples, are huge in my reading history. Alright, so next I have Robert R. McCammon. Now this guy, he was the first one. He was my first, he broke my horror virginity, so to speak. And he was also my first favorite horror writer. And so these books that I'm going to mention here are they're very nostalgic for me, and that's the one reason why I'm going to suggest them. You might not feel the same, obviously, but I think old 80s and maybe late 70s, but probably 80s, Robert R. McCammon is where it's at, man. So I'm going to suggest here Stinger. I think Stinger, the first book I read by McCammon was Swan Song, and I moved right away to Stinger, and Stinger just blew me away. It's basically about a small town, a small American town in the middle of, I think it's the Arizona desert. Small town in Arizona, I think. And it's an alien invasion story, and an alien ship crashes down, and it's kind of like Tremors in a sense, because I think this thing tunnels underground and it comes up and in people's homes and it kills them. It's I could be wrong about that. It's been a very long time. I've been meaning to reread some of these books because like the way they're in here, I think I need to go in, but I'm afraid to go and investigate them again because I'm afraid that I'm not going to like them. I'm going to think they're crap, and it's like, that would ruin that nostalgia. But Stinger was a lot of fun. Mystery Walk became one of my favorite books for a very long time. Mystery Walk was a lot of fun. I remember it was an interesting take on Christianity, and it has very strong good versus evil. There's a basement scene in Mystery Walk that really creeped me out when I was younger. I'm going to just leave it at that. It kind of made me afraid of basements for a very long time. And They Thirst. They Thirst is very much Robert R. McCammon's Salem's Lot, but instead of in a small American town, this one takes place in LA. But it has the same sort of idea, in that the big baddie vampire moves in and starts slowly turning people into vampires until you have this whole horde of vampires that is threatening to take over the world almost. Moving on to Bentley Little. Bentley Little, I didn't discover him actually until my 20s. But I found that his novels can be kind of hit or miss with me, but his short stories are so much fun. And I read an article that kind of confirmed that he feels this way too. And that was kind of relieving in a sense, because I guess because the reason why he struggles, or why his novels tend to be hit or miss, is because he's often under deadlines, of course. And so he has to rush to get them done, and sometimes he just doesn't have the time to take care of the story like he would normally want to. But his short stories, on the other hand, he has more time, because he's not often, or not always, under a deadline unless he's writing for an anthology or whatever. And I think he also just said that he has more fun writing short stories. So I definitely I would recommend the collection. You can find this in two different ways. I believe the first time it came out, it was just one volume, the collection. It's like 500-600 page book. It's pretty big anyways. Collection of short stories, and I think somebody else republished it into 2 volumes. I don't know why they did that. It's not necessary to do that, but there it is. I can also suggest his book, The Mailman. This book isn't necessarily as relevant today as it was back when it was written, but it's still a lot of fun, I think. It'll make you think just about how much power the mail service has over you, especially if there's an evil entity involved. And one of his more recent books, at least within the last 10 years or so, The Haunted. This is a haunted house story that involves a family that move into a house, and then they just can't move out once they figure out that this place there's something wrong here. There's terrible things happening. And I think this is more a story about getting stuck in something that you can't get out of once you get in it. So you buy a house, everyone says, oh, the house is haunted, just move. You can't do that always. You get stuck in payments and in debt, and you just moved in, there's no way you can just sell the house and move back out. It's not that easy, and this book really explores that idea, but it also goes into some very dark territory, and I highly recommend it, as I do all these books, of course. Now, The Haunted kind of brings me into a topic, a horror book topic that's fairly popular. I want to discuss a little bit about, and that's haunted houses, because the haunted house is pretty much where horror started. I think you could say horror started way back in like the 1800s. Of course, it goes back way farther than that. Horror stories have been around since, you know, caveman days. But when we started writing them, they always started with ghost stories or haunted house stories. And some modern ones here I'm going to recommend to you. It's Kill Creek by Scott Thomas. It's a pretty interesting take on the haunted house story, and I think it would be great for beginners because it takes all the tropes of haunted houses, pretty much all the popular tropes, but it changes them up, and it makes them unique and interesting, and more importantly, it makes them a lot of fun. So Kill Creek by Scott Thomas is about I think it's 4 horror writers. They are challenged by this guy who wants to pick their brain, basically, while they stay over at this haunted house. And that's where I'm going to leave it, because while they're there, they're only there for one night, and then the novel continues as just sort of like the after effects after the events of that one night. And I think it's Halloween night that they stay there. And so it's very interesting to see what happens to these characters and how Scott Thomas took the typical haunted house tropes and then sort of spun them on their heads a little bit. And also another book I read recently, The Good House by Tananarive. This book is very good. I listened to the audiobook, and although I didn't really enjoy the ending as much as some other people did, I found this book to be, for the most part, very creepy and very sad. Once again, we're going into the territory of loss and grief. So definitely check out The Good House. It's also about family history and how that can haunt you as well. So definitely check out The Good House by Tananarive. Now I'm going to move on to some indie horrors, in case, you know, I have a pretty long list here, so I'm trying to kind of not talk too long about these books. I have like another 6 books here, actually 10 books that I want to discuss. So I want to move into indie horror, because today, you know, indie horror kind of started off as an indie thing. Kindle books, Amazon Kindle really changed up everything, and suddenly now indie horror is huge, much more bigger than it ever was. And you can thank Amazon Kindle for that. There's both good and bad things for that. I say the majority is probably good, because I would probably have never read these authors otherwise. Anyways, Tim Curran, he's one of my favorite writers, and I'd highly recommend Dead Sea. Dead Sea is very big, so if you're intimidated by thick books, you might want to avoid that one, maybe. But it's about the Bermuda Triangle, and a ship is sailing through the Bermuda Triangle when the Bermuda Triangle does its thing, and so you get to see what happens to the people who disappear when they're in the Bermuda Triangle. Of course, it's a fictional story. So they're basically taken into sort of like an alternate reality, where or an alternate dimension where monsters exist and ghost ships. And it's just a creepy, well-done story. Tim Curran is very good at creating monsters and creating creepy scenes when he wants to. I also want to recommend Fear Me. I talk about this one a lot on here, because Fear Me is it's prison horror, and I found it very creepy. I absolutely love this story, and I always recommend it whenever I can. Gemma Amor is an author I've recently discovered. I would recommend the 2 books I've read by her. Dear Laura, which is about a serial killer who abducts the main character's best friend, and then sends her letters saying that he killed her best friend. He killed her, and if she wants to know more as to where the body is and all that, then she has to do things that he wants her to do, and he's going to mail her these requests, and it just evolves from there. It's very, very twisted, but it's very good too. And also Girl on Fire, which I recently read. This book is so much fun. It's more action horror, I would say, but it has Gemma Amor's style to it, and it's very violent and very angry, so I highly recommend that. And Kealan Patrick Burke. I don't think Kealan Patrick Burke gets enough love here on BookTube, so I'm going to recommend a couple by him. My first by Kealan was Turtle Boy. This book is very much a Lovecraftian tale, and it's also a very, very good coming-of-age story. And also Dead Leaves, if you want an autumnal, I always have trouble saying that word, an autumnal, you know, it's a collection of short stories that takes place during autumn, and so there's also some Halloween stories in there. It's perfect for reading on a chilly autumn day. And now we're going to move into some classics, and then there's 4 more books here, then we'll be done. By classics, I mean anything pretty much before 1950, I believe. Yeah, pretty much. Hell, even before 1940. So, I would recommend the collected works of H.P. Lovecraft. The collected fiction of H.P. Lovecraft. I highly recommend this. And it's kind of fun to go through all the stories that H.P. Lovecraft wrote, and then follow the corresponding episodes of the H.P. Lovecraft Literary Podcast, because they did this about 10 years ago, 9-10 years ago, where they went through all the stories and they discussed them. You'll learn a lot about H.P. Lovecraft, and you'll learn about what to avoid if you don't like his awful points of view. But his fiction, for the most part, is excellent. I would highly recommend staying away from his poetry. but yeah, his the complete fiction of H.P. Lovecraft is a phenomenal. I mean, it changed the course of history. It's almost as powerful as Stephen King. In fact, Stephen King is influenced by him. All right, next up. Edgar Allan Poe. How could you not mention Edgar Allan Poe? I think he's the very, very first writer to even make horror come on the literary. People take notice of horror, I guess you could say, because he, you know, stories like the Black Cat. But you know, I would pick up his collected short stories as well. He also has a novella. I can't remember the name of it, but it basically takes place, I believe, in the Arctic, and it also pretty much, from my understanding anyway, created the entire detective serial type book that's so popular today. Edgar Allan Poe really changed things up as well. His stories are very they're neurotic, and they're dark, and they're quite fascinating, to be honest. The Willows and Wendigo by Algernon Blackwood. These are 2 different stories. The Willows is about a trip gone horribly wrong. It's like a boating trip down a river, and the 2 characters decide to stay on this little island, and very weird things start to happen. And the Wendigo, this story actually gave me the creeps. I would highly recommend it for that alone. I'm not going to go into why it gave me the creeps, because I think you need to go into this story absolutely blind, and when the creepy thing happens, you're going to be like, oh, at least I was. And finally, Ghost Stories of an Antiquary by M.R. James. More ghost stories here, but M.R. James, back in his time, he was absolutely the master of writing the ghost story. I think M.R. James is actually responsible for the rather short-lived British custom of reading ghost stories on Christmas Eve, and I think M.R. James even has a collection out, or at least there's a collection out of appropriate stories to tell on Christmas Eve if you want to do that. And that's another reason why I think it's good to read him, because not only you get a good idea of what a good ghost story is, and these ghost stories of an antiquary are bloody well, they're brilliant. In fact, I think the very first story in this collection may have influenced Clive Barker's Rawhead Rex. I'm not entirely sure on that, but there's a lot of similarities. All right, so thank you for watching, especially if you made it this far. Keep being creative, keep being safe, and I'll catch you guys in the next bookish video.